The billionaire CEO's triplets had only 1 week to live, until the black waitress did the impossible. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible tale. In a city where wealth and power often define one's worth, there was one man who thought money could solve anything. His name was Richard Kelson, the CEO of Kelson Tech, a multi-billion-dollar tech empire that had its hands in everything from artificial intelligence to the latest advancements in medical research. Richard had it all: a mansion in Malibu, a private jet, a collection of cars worth millions, and a family that he loved dearly. But there was one thing money couldn't buy, and that was time. Richard's triplets, his precious children, were all battling a rare genetic disorder, and doctors had given them only a week to live. The Kelson family was devastated, unable to find any treatment or cure that could save them. Richard had spared no expense. He hired the best doctors, consulted top medical experts from around the world, and even looked into experimental treatments that cost a fortune. But despite his wealth and influence, his children were slipping away, and he felt utterly powerless. The clock was ticking. Each passing day felt like a lifetime, and with every test that came back negative, Richard's hope for a miracle grew dimmer. In his desperation, Richard turned to alternative medicine, hiring countless so-called specialists who promised to save his children. Yet nothing worked. The days bled into one another in a blur of hospital visits and frantic phone calls. The once proud CEO was now reduced to a man on his knees, pleading for a solution. One rainy evening, as Richard sat in his office, his hands shaking with the weight of the world's expectations and his heart breaking for his children, he received an unexpected phone call. It wasn't from a doctor or a specialist. It was from a waitress named Amara. She worked at a small diner downtown, a place where Richard had never given a second thought. Amara had heard about the triplets' condition through a friend, and she called Richard out of the blue, offering a solution he had never even considered. She didn't have a medical degree, nor did she have any formal qualifications. But Amara claimed to know something about healing, something that doctors had missed. Richard was skeptical at first. How could someone with no medical background help his children? But as the conversation continued, something about Amara's calm demeanor and her unshakable conviction struck a chord with him. He was willing to try anything at this point. Desperation had a way of making a person do the unthinkable. Richard agreed to meet her the next day. And that decision, one born out of sheer desperation, would change everything. Little did he know that the woman he once saw as just a waitress was about to do the impossible. The next morning, Richard sat nervously in the plush leather chair of his office, his thoughts racing. The night had been restless, filled with worry for his triplets, who were growing weaker by the hour. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, and Richard's mind kept replaying the conversation with Amara. Could she really help his children? Or was this just another wild hope to cling to in his desperation? He stood up, pacing the room, staring out the large windows at the San Francisco skyline. His phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Amara. Her calm voice on the other end of the line was like a lifeline in the midst of his storm. "I'll meet you at noon, at your place," she said, her words steady and unwavering. Richard didn't hesitate. He agreed immediately, unsure of what to expect, but willing to try anything. The drive to the meeting place felt surreal. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to step into the unknown. Amara was a waitress. How could someone with no medical experience possibly have the answer? Yet, there was something about her that made him want to believe. When he arrived at the address, it was a small, quiet cafe tucked away in a corner of the city. The smell of fresh coffee and baked pastries filled the air as Richard walked in. Amara was already there, sitting at a table near the window, her calm demeanor unchanged. She stood when she saw him, offering a warm but reserved smile. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. Richard nodded, his anxiety still high. He sat down across from her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. But Amara was unwavering. She looked at him with eyes that held a quiet strength, as though she had already seen this moment play out in her mind. I know you're skeptical, she began, breaking the silence. But sometimes the answers we need are not the ones we expect. You've been looking for a cure, but sometimes healing is not about what we can do with science. Sometimes it's about something deeper. Richard frowned, trying to understand. What do you mean? My children are dying. I don't have time for anything that isn't going to save them. Amara nodded, acknowledging his frustration. I understand. And I don't have a miracle drug, but I do have something that can give them a fighting chance. She paused, letting her words sink in. It's not something that can be seen in a lab. It's something that comes from within. Your children need more than just medicine. They need hope, and they need love. Richard's brow furrowed, the weight of his disbelief still heavy on him. Hope and love? I'm afraid those aren't going to cure their disease, Amara. Amara's eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. It's not just about the disease, Richard. It's about the energy, the will to fight. I've seen people heal in ways doctors can't explain, and I believe your children can do the same. But they need your belief, too. They need you to be their strength when they can't find it in themselves. Richard sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to think. He had always relied on logic, on facts, on the science that had built his empire. But now, here he was, sitting across from a waitress who was telling him to put his faith in something intangible. He didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain, he had to try. So what do we do? He asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Amara smiled softly. You trust me, and you trust that your children can find the strength to fight this. I have a method that has worked for others. It's unconventional, but I believe it will give your children the chance they need. Richard didn't hesitate any longer. He was willing to do anything to save his children, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Okay, he said, his voice steady now. I'll do whatever it takes. Let's try your way. The next few days were a blur. Amara guided Richard and his family through a series of exercises and practices that seemed so simple, yet so profound. It wasn't just about physical treatments. It was about the energy that surrounded the family, the connection they shared, and the love that flowed between them. And slowly, miraculously, Richard began to see the changes. His children, once frail and weak, started showing signs of life. Their energy levels increased, their spirits lifted, and for the first time in days, Richard saw a glimmer of hope. It was working. The impossible was becoming possible. And in that moment, Richard realized that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones that come from a laboratory or a pill bottle. Sometimes they come from the people who believe in us when we've lost faith in ourselves. As the days passed, Richard watched in awe as his children continued to improve. Each day brought more hope, more signs that Amara's methods were working, even though they seemed so far removed from traditional medicine. The triplets, once fragile and lethargic, now showed bursts of energy, laughter filling the rooms of the Kelson mansion where silence had once reigned. They were playing, interacting with their toys, and their smiles returned like the first rays of sun after a storm. Richard could hardly believe his eyes. His children were fighting, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relief. But there was still one question that lingered in his mind. How was it possible? How had a woman with no medical training been able to accomplish what the top doctors in the world couldn't? He needed answers. He needed to understand what had happened to his family. One evening, after another round of sessions with Amara, Richard invited her to his private study. He had been pacing the room, trying to put the pieces together. He had to know more. Amara, he began, his voice quieter than usual. I don't understand. I've tried everything. Money, doctors, treatments. Yet here we are. My children are alive, thriving. Even, and I owe it to you. But I have to know, what did you do? Amara sat across from him, her expression calm, unbothered by the question that Richard had asked so many times in his mind. She looked at him with a softness in her eyes, as though she had been waiting for this moment. I didn't do anything, Richard. I just showed them what they needed most, the strength that already existed within them, she said, her voice steady and comforting. Richard frowned, trying to grasp what she meant. But that doesn't make sense. What you did, it's not science. How could something intangible work when nothing else did? Amara's gaze softened even further. She had seen this moment coming. The moment when Richard would need to understand, the moment when he would need to believe in something greater than himself, greater than the empire he had built. It's not about what's tangible, Richard. It's about belief. belief in yourself and in the people you love. Your children, your family, they needed more than medicine. They needed to know they were worth fighting for. When you gave them that belief, when you opened your heart to the idea that love and hope can heal, that's when they began to heal, she explained gently. Richard's mind was racing. He had always been a man of logic, a man of power and control. But what Amara said resonated with him in a way he couldn't ignore. For the first time, he understood. It wasn't the doctors or the money that had the power to save his children. It was the love that he had for them, and the belief that he could be their strength. Amara's methods weren't about science or formulas. They were about the human spirit, the emotional connection that could transcend any illness. The realization hit him hard, but it also brought him a strange sense of peace. He had been searching for a cure, for something he could control. But what he had really needed was to let go, to trust in something bigger than himself. And now, he was beginning to do that. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of reflection. Richard spent more time with his children, no longer consumed by the pressure of business deals and meetings. He was there, in the moment, for the first time in years. He played with his triplets, laughed with them, and held them close. He could see their strength, their resilience, and he knew that, just like Amara had said, they were worth fighting for. As the week came to a close, the triplets were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. The doctors were amazed at their recovery, but Richard knew the truth. It wasn't just the treatments they had received. It was the power of love, of hope, and of the belief that healing could come from places no one had expected. One evening, as he sat with Amara in his study, he looked at her with a new understanding. "You've given us more than just hope, Amara," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've given us a chance to believe in something we couldn't see before." Amara smiled, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "I just showed you what was always there, Richard. The rest was up to you." Richard nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of healing. It wasn't about having the most money or the most power. It was about love, belief, and the strength of the human spirit. And as he looked at his children, now full of life and laughter, he knew that the impossible had been made possible, not by science or medicine, but by the power of the heart. As the weeks went by, Richard found himself spending more time with his children. What started as a desperate attempt to save their lives had transformed into a journey of rediscovery. He had always been a workaholic, buried in meetings and business deals, but now, with his children's health improving day by day, he was beginning to see the world differently. Amara had given him more than just a way to save his children. She had shown him what truly mattered. As the triplets grew stronger, Richard's focus shifted. He spent hours playing with them, laughing with them, and doing things he hadn't done in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to be fully present, not just physically, but emotionally. He had always been the protector, the provider, but now, he was learning to be their anchor, their source of comfort and strength. The shift wasn't just evident in his relationship with his children, but in his entire outlook on life. The CEO who once measured success by numbers and market shares was now measuring it by moments. The laughter of his children, the smile of his wife, and the quiet joy of simply being together. One afternoon, as Richard sat on the porch with his triplets, watching them run around and play, he realized that Amara had not only saved his children, but had also saved him from a life consumed by ambition and achievement. He no longer felt the overwhelming need to chase after success at the cost of everything else. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of family and love. But as his family's world began to heal, the world outside was starting to notice the incredible story of the Kelson family's miraculous recovery. News outlets began to pick up the story of the CEO's triplets defying all odds, and soon, the media was knocking on Richard's door. They wanted to know the secret to his children's recovery, the breakthrough that had changed everything. Richard wasn't sure how to explain it all. How could he explain the intangible force that had saved his children when everything else had failed? The truth was, it wasn't just about one miracle treatment. It was about the people who believed in his family when they had lost all hope. Amara had been the first to offer that belief, and it had made all the difference. As reporters gathered outside his home, Richard made a decision. He would no longer hide the truth. He owed it to his children, to Amara, and to the millions of people who had been following their story to share what had really happened. One by one, he invited the media into his home, answering their questions and speaking from the heart. He told them about the doctors, the treatments, and the countless hours spent trying to save his children. But he also told them about Amara, the waitress who had shown him the power of belief and love. He spoke about how she had never once promised a miracle, but had simply offered a chance for his children to fight, to survive, and to live. The media coverage was overwhelming, and soon, the world was talking about the Kelson family's extraordinary journey. Richard's story wasn't just about a billionaire CEO. It was about a family's struggle, their triumph over adversity, and the kindness of a stranger who had given them a second chance. As the media frenzy continued, Richard realized that this was only the beginning. He had a new purpose now, one that went beyond his business empire. He wanted to ensure that Amara's message, that love and belief could heal even the deepest wounds, reached as many people as possible. Richard's life had been changed in ways he couldn't have imagined, and he was determined to honor that change. He began using his platform, his wealth, and his influence to support causes that aligned with the values Amara had shown him. He donated millions to medical research focused on rare diseases, and he launched programs to help underprivileged communities access healthcare. But most importantly, he made sure that Amara's story, the woman who had saved his family, was never forgotten. He publicly recognized her as the person who had brought the family back from the brink. And, in return, Amara used her newfound platform to help others who were facing impossible odds, using her story as a beacon of hope for those who had nowhere else to turn. As Richard sat in his office one evening, reflecting on everything that had transpired, he realized that he had been given a gift far greater than any material wealth he could ever possess. He had been given a second chance, not just for his children, but for himself, his family, and the world. He had learned that the greatest things in life couldn't be bought. They had to be earned through love, compassion, and a willingness to believe in the impossible. As Richard's public recognition of Amara's role in his family's recovery spread, his life took on a new sense of purpose. The world had watched as his children defied the odds, and now, the world was waiting for him to do something even bigger. He had found a new calling, one that aligned with the lessons he had learned over the past few months. Lessons that had transformed him from a driven businessman obsessed with success into a man who understood the true power of kindness, love, and community. Richard had always believed in the power of business to change the world, but now, he saw that real change came from the heart. He had spent years building an empire, but in those months since his children had fallen ill, he had realized that the most important legacy he could leave behind wasn't a billion-dollar company. It was the way he treated people, the way he gave back, and the way he inspired others to believe in the impossible. His next step came naturally. He set up the Kelson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing health care for families facing rare and life-threatening illnesses. He wanted to make sure that no other family would have to face the overwhelming sense of helplessness that he had felt just a few months ago. The Foundation's first initiative was a nationwide campaign to bring attention to rare genetic disorders, diseases that often go unnoticed by mainstream medical research. Richard knew that these diseases didn't have the flashy appeal of more common illnesses, but he also knew that the families affected by them deserved just as much attention, just as much care. Amara, once just a waitress, was now an integral part of the foundation, her name becoming synonymous with hope and resilience. She had agreed to help Richard lead the charge, using her story to bring awareness and to show others that anyone, regardless of their background, could make a difference. Richard and Amara traveled across the country together, visiting hospitals, meeting with families, and speaking at conferences. Everywhere they went, they were met with admiration and gratitude. People who had once been overlooked, just like Amara, now had a voice, and that voice was being heard. Richard's connection with Amara deepened, not just as business partners, but as friends. She had been the catalyst for his transformation, and now he couldn't imagine his life without her. As they worked together, Richard was constantly amazed by Amara's humility, her unwavering belief in the power of love and community, and her ability to stay grounded even as her own life had changed beyond recognition. She had never sought fame or recognition, but now, She was one of the most sought-after advocates for families affected by rare diseases. The Kelson Foundation's work didn't stop at awareness. Richard knew that real change required action, and he used his business acumen to secure funding for medical research and to push for policy changes that would make treatments for rare diseases more accessible. He worked with lawmakers to introduce new legislation that would provide funding for research into rare genetic disorders, and he partnered with top research institutions to fund studies that would lead to new treatments. As the foundation grew, so did Richard's understanding of what it meant to truly lead. He no longer saw his role as simply being the head of a company. He saw himself as a steward of change, a person responsible for creating opportunities and making a positive impact on the world. Through his work with the foundation, Richard had found a new kind of success, one that was measured not in profits, but in lives changed and hope restored. It was a success that he could be proud of, a success that was built on love, compassion, and the belief that every life had value. As the years passed, the Kelson Foundation grew into one of the most influential nonprofits in the country, and Richard and Amara became recognized as champions for families who had been ignored for too long. Their work had sparked a movement that showed the world that even the smallest act of kindness could lead to the most powerful transformations. And through it all, Richard never forgot what had truly saved his family: the power of love, the power of belief, and the power of a woman who had once been dismissed by the world but had proven that she could do the impossible. As the foundation's work continued to grow, Richard found himself at the forefront of an entirely new kind of leadership. He had once believed that power was something to be conquered, something to be earned through hard work, negotiation, and influence. But now, he understood that true power came from within. It was the power of connection, of belief, and of using whatever platform you had to make a difference. Richard's life was no longer about climbing the corporate ladder or expanding his empire. It was about giving back, and he was doing just that through the Kelson Foundation. The ripple effect of the work he and Amara had started was felt across the country, as families facing rare diseases began to find hope in places they had never expected. Stories of healing and recovery, though not always miraculous, were being shared by the thousands. Richard began to feel like a part of something bigger, something that transcended the business world he had once known. As he sat in a meeting with other philanthropists, discussing ways to amplify their efforts, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. The man who had once seen the world in terms of profit margins and market share was now thinking in terms of lives saved and families empowered. And the person who had shown him how to make that shift wasn't some business guru or investor. It was Amara, the woman who had started out as a waitress and had changed the course of his life. He looked over at her as she spoke during the meeting, her words calm but powerful as she outlined plans to further the foundation's reach. Amara had become more than just a partner in the foundation. She had become a symbol of everything Richard had come to believe in: kindness, resilience, and the ability to transform even the darkest situations. She had not only saved his children's lives, but she had opened his eyes to a world of possibility beyond what he had ever imagined. Their bond had deepened over the years, and Richard found himself increasingly relying on Amara's wisdom and perspective. In the quiet moments when they weren't busy planning initiatives or strategizing for the foundation, they often talked about their pasts, about the challenges they had faced, and about how they both had risen from circumstances that could have broken them. Amara, too, had grown into a woman who believed in the power of change, in the ability to shape the future through small acts of kindness and conviction. She had never sought fame or fortune, but now, as the face of the foundation, she was influencing a generation of young people who saw her not just as a hero, but as a living example of the power of perseverance. As the foundation flourished, so did their friendship. Richard found himself opening up to her in ways he had never done before. He shared his fears, his doubts, and his hopes for the future. Amara, in turn, was a steady presence, always ready to offer support, whether it was in the form of words of encouragement or simply being there when he needed someone to listen. Their partnership was a testament to the power of unexpected connections. Together, they continued to push forward with new initiatives, one of which was a national awareness campaign aimed at bringing attention to mental health and its connection to physical well-being. Richard was adamant that the stigma surrounding mental health needed to be broken, especially within the wealthy elite, who often dismissed mental health struggles as weakness. He knew that his own success had been rooted in his ability to compartmentalize his emotions, but now he realized how dangerous that had been. The pressure, the stress, the isolation, it had taken a toll on him, and he had almost lost everything because of it. But thanks to Amara's influence, he began to understand that true strength came from vulnerability, from embracing the things that made him human. Their mental health campaign became one of the most successful the country had ever seen, and Richard couldn't help but feel proud of what they had accomplished. The impact of their work was being felt in ways he hadn't anticipated. People were talking, opening up, and seeking help. The dialogue had shifted, and Richard knew they had played a part in making that happen. But as he looked back on everything they had achieved, he realized that the most important lesson he had learned was not about success, not about the foundation, but about the power of personal transformation. The journey from CEO to philanthropist had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every moment. Richard and Amara's work was far from over. They knew that there was still much to be done. But now, they approached each challenge not with fear or doubt, but with the belief that, together, they could overcome anything. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Richard had finally found his true calling, and Amara had been the one to help him discover it. As the months passed, the Kelson Foundation continued to grow, and with it, Richard's understanding of what true success really meant. The initiatives he and Amara had launched were gaining momentum, but as their reach expanded, so did the challenges they faced. Richard's newfound perspective on life had made him more passionate than ever about creating a lasting impact. But he also realized that in order to make a real difference, he would have to confront his own past and the hidden truths about the system that had shaped his worldview. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Richard sat in his office reflecting on the progress they had made. The foundation was thriving, but something gnawed at him, an undeniable urge to dig deeper into the roots of inequality and injustice that still permeated society. His wealth and influence had allowed him to make a difference, but he began to wonder, was he doing enough? Was the foundation truly addressing the systemic issues, or was it just scratching the surface? Amara, who had become a trusted confidant, walked into his office with her usual quiet confidence. She could sense the shift in Richard's demeanor. "You've been thinking too much again," she said, sitting across from him. Richard smiled faintly. "I suppose I have. I'm grateful for everything we've accomplished, but sometimes I wonder if we're just treating the symptoms and not the cause." Amara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. "We've been helping families, raising awareness, funding research. But there's still so much inequality, so much that's buried beneath the surface. The system is broken, Amara. It's not just about rare diseases or healthcare. It's about the deeper issues that prevent so many people from ever having a chance." Amara nodded slowly, understanding exactly where Richard was coming from. She had seen it all, the divide between the wealthy and the underprivileged, the barriers that people like her had to face every day. "So, what are you going to do about it?" she asked. Richard took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. He had spent years building a business empire, but he knew now that it was never going to be enough. He couldn't fix the world by simply throwing money at it. The solution had to be deeper, more meaningful. He stood up, pacing the room as the idea began to take shape. "It's time for me to use my position, my influence, to create real change. We need to address the systemic issues that keep people in poverty, that prevent them from accessing education, healthcare, and basic opportunities. We need to create a movement that tackles these problems head-on." Amara stood up, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "That's exactly what we've been working toward, Richard. We've been helping individuals, but now it's time to help the system change. What's your plan?" Richard paused, thinking for a moment. "We need to partner with policymakers, work with community leaders, and create a platform that empowers those who have been forgotten by the system. We need to fight for economic equality, for access to resources, for a system that works for everyone, not just the wealthy. We've been given a chance to make a real impact, Amara, and it's time to take that chance." The vision he had started to develop felt more real than anything he had ever worked on before. It wasn't just about curing diseases or funding research. It was about dismantling the structures that perpetuated inequality. It was about changing the rules of the game so that everyone, regardless of their background, had the same opportunities to succeed. As Richard and Amara began to strategize their next move, they realized the scale of what they were about to undertake. They knew it wasn't going to be easy. The challenges would be immense, and the resistance they would face from those who benefited from the status quo would be fierce. But they were ready. They had already overcome impossible odds, and they knew that if they worked together, they could change the world. Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a change maker, someone who was using his power to fight for justice. And as he looked across the room at Amara, he knew that together, they could accomplish something truly extraordinary. The work ahead would be difficult, but it was the kind of work that mattered. It was the kind of work that would leave a legacy not just of wealth, but of equality, opportunity, and hope for generations to come. As they dove into the complexities of their new mission, Richard couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this point. A journey that had started with the desperate need to save his children, but had evolved into a life mission that would change the course of history. Richard had found his true calling, and it was no longer about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about tearing down the walls that kept so many from even having a chance to begin the climb. As Richard and Amara's vision began to take shape, they found themselves at the crossroads of something monumental. The path ahead was clear, but the road was long and filled with challenges. They had set out to reform the very systems that had shaped their lives and the lives of so many others, but they quickly realized that changing a system that had been in place for generations was not going to be easy. They began meeting with leaders from across the country, activists, community organizers, and policymakers, looking to build a coalition that could turn their vision into reality. It was hard work, but it was work that filled Richard with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He knew that the changes they were working toward would take time, but he also knew that he was no longer just waiting for change to happen. He was actively making it happen. The first major project they launched was a nationwide education initiative aimed at closing the gap between wealthy communities and disadvantaged ones. They focused on providing high-quality education to children in underfunded schools, with a particular emphasis on mentorship programs and access to resources that would give them a fighting chance in a system that was stacked against them. It was one of the toughest battles they would face. The resistance was fierce. Many of the wealthiest people in the country were reluctant to give up their grip on power. They viewed education as a commodity that only the privileged should have access to, and they fought tooth and nail to maintain the status quo. But Richard, armed with the lessons he had learned about the power of belief, knew that change was possible. He had seen it in his own children, in their ability to overcome what seemed impossible. And now, he would fight for the same chance for children across the country. Amara, ever the calm and steady presence, was by his side every step of the way. She had always been the one to remind him of the importance of patience and persistence. "We can't change everything overnight," she often said. "But we can start with one step. One person, one family." It was this mindset that kept Richard grounded, even as the pressure mounted. The media coverage of their efforts grew, and soon, they had the attention of the nation. People from all walks of life were rallying behind their cause. What started as a small movement grew into a nationwide initiative, and the ripple effects were felt far beyond what Richard had ever imagined. The success of their education campaign led to other initiatives. They partnered with healthcare providers to create affordable healthcare programs for underserved communities. They pushed for legislation that would ensure fair wages for workers, especially those in industries where labor was often exploited. They worked tirelessly to break down the barriers that had kept so many people stuck in cycles of poverty. Richard and Amara were no longer just business partners. They were co-conspirators in a revolution that was reshaping the very fabric of society. But even as they celebrated their victories, Richard knew that there was still much more to be done. The journey had only just begun. There were still too many families who didn't have access to the resources they needed to thrive. Too many communities that were left behind, their voices silenced by a system that didn't value them. Richard could feel the weight of that responsibility on his shoulders. It wasn't just about his own success anymore. It was about the success of everyone who had been overlooked. Amara, too, felt the burden, but she had never wavered in her belief that they could create lasting change. Together, they were unstoppable. And though they knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, they also knew that they had something more powerful than money or influence. The unwavering belief that a better world was not just possible, but within reach. The foundation they had built was no longer just an organization. It had become a movement, one that was changing lives and inspiring others to take action. Richard looked at Amara, his partner in this journey, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had been the one to show him that true success wasn't measured by wealth or status, but by the impact one had on the lives of others. He couldn't have asked for a better ally in this fight for justice and equality. As they looked toward the future, they knew the work was far from over. There would be setbacks, there would be obstacles, but there would also be progress. And every step they took, no matter how small, would bring them closer to a world where opportunity was available to everyone, not just the privileged few. As the years passed, Richard and Amara continued to lead the Kelson Foundation, their efforts bringing real change to communities that had been forgotten for far too long. They had built something extraordinary, an organization that not only provided resources, but also inspired people from all walks of life to believe in the power of their actions. Their journey had been difficult, but it had been worth every challenge, every setback. And now, as they stood at the pinnacle of their success, they knew they had only scratched the surface of what they could achieve. The foundation's work had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who had long been silenced by inequality. Richard had once believed that the world was about power, money, and influence, but now he understood that the true measure of success was in the lives they had touched, the barriers they had broken down, and the lives that had been forever changed. The media coverage was still overwhelming, but Richard had grown accustomed to the attention. What mattered now wasn't the fame, but the impact. What mattered was knowing that their work had made a real difference. It wasn't just about curing diseases or providing health care. It was about giving people the opportunity to rewrite their own stories. As they celebrated the Foundation's 10th anniversary, Richard couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. He thought back to the day when his children were on the brink of death, when he had been on the edge of losing everything, and how Amara had stepped in and changed everything. She had been the catalyst for his transformation, and now, together, they had built a legacy that was much greater than anything Richard had ever imagined. The work had been hard, but it had also been the most fulfilling thing he had ever done. He had found his true purpose, not in the boardrooms of his tech empire, but in the people whose lives he had touched. He had learned that the true power of wealth wasn't in hoarding it, but in using it to create opportunities for others. And Amara, with her quiet strength and unwavering belief in the goodness of people, had been the heart of that mission. As the anniversary event came to a close, Richard stood beside Amara, watching the crowd of supporters and volunteers who had come together to celebrate all they had accomplished. There was a sense of fulfillment in the air, a recognition of how much had been achieved, but also an understanding that their work was far from over. There were still countless families in need, still countless children who lacked the resources to succeed, and Richard knew that the fight for justice and equality would continue for years to come. "We've done something incredible," Richard said, turning to Amara. "But we both know this is just the beginning." Amara smiled, her eyes filled with the same quiet resolve that had always defined her. "We've only just begun to change the world, Richard," she said. "There's so much more we can do, so much more that needs to be done." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of their shared responsibility, but also the excitement of the future ahead. The foundation had grown into a force that couldn't be ignored, and they were ready to take it even further. Together, they had become a symbol of what could happen when two people, from entirely different walks of life, came together with a shared vision of change. They had built something that wasn't just about making money or gaining power. It was about lifting others up, about showing the world that love, kindness, and belief could change even the most entrenched systems. As they walked off the stage, hand in hand, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. He had once thought that his success was defined by the companies he built, the wealth he accumulated. But now, he understood that success wasn't about how much you had, it was about how much you gave. And with Amara by his side, he knew they would continue giving, continue fighting for those who had been overlooked, and continue working to make the world a better place for all. They were more than just business partners now. They were family. And the legacy they were building wasn't just about what they had achieved. It was about what they would continue to create, together, for generations to come.